So let's talk about framing. You start out with a print, and you've decided that you want to frame your print up, make it look nice, all of that good stuff. I've selected here a print that's got a very traditional sort of framing. It's got a traditional border, and then it has signature at the bottom. So what you want to start out with is you need to figure out what would be a good size frame for your artwork. And so one way to do that is you want to start out by measuring your image. So I'm going to pull this out here. This is 20.5 by 14. So write down the size of the frame that the image, and then think about what would be a good amount of border on each side. If you have trouble visualizing this, it's not a bad idea to cut a strip of paper and lay it atop your print and then look at how that looks. Generally speaking, with a print this big, I would say that 2 to 2.5 inches will look good. So generally speaking, you want to be in the 2 to 3 inch range for most prints. Anything beyond that, unless it's really massive, can look a little excessive. So I've decided that my frame will have a 3-inch border on the top, the sides, and then a 3.5-inch border on the bottom. So I kind of drew this out here. So my image starting size is 20.5 by 14, but I'm adding 6 inches to this width, and then 6.5 inches to the height, right? Because I want to include both the top and that extra ½ inch that I'm including on the bottom. So that means that my mat is going to be 26.5 by 20.5. And it's just good to diagram it out just so you can visualize it a little bit better. Alright, so conveniently, I already have a mat cut down for this print at these dimensions. So this is what that would look like for print. So with this image, you could give it like a 2.5-inch border all the way around. A 3-inch border is going to give it a little bit more presence on the wall and will look just fine. But that's a sort of aesthetic choice. You want to decide what you think looks good for your work. As I've continued to frame work, I kind of opted for smaller margins now, but it's really a matter of taste. So that's this. What I'm using here underneath my print, this is Archival foam core, and you can get this at most art supply stores. It has more of a like rag paper surface, and it's a really beautiful shade of off-white. There's a couple different ones. Some of them are bright white, but there's this. If you can find this off-white Archival acid-free foam core, it's beautiful for framing, and conveniently is a really good color for the paper color that I tend to work on. So just a really good option. So when I float my prints, as in I don't use a window mat and I just tape the print directly to this foam core, this is the sort of border that would show, right? It's always really important to use acid-free materials. You'd be surprised how often art supply stores or craft stores will have, if it doesn't say acid-free, it isn't. And if you ever see an old print in someone's house and there's like a little dark brown edge around the inner area, it's been discolored through age and the acid content. All right. Generally speaking, I get a large sheet of this acid-free foam core and I will cut it down to size. When you are cutting, and I'm not going to actually cut this one because it's already cut down to size, but when you are cutting with foam core, it's actually really important to hold the knife and don't try to cut all the way through in one go. It's much better to have a steady hand, control the pressure of the stroke, and just keep the blade totally perpendicular to the table, and you can make multiple slices just like that, and eventually you'll get a really beautiful straight down cut. So don't try to make sure your blade is sharp always, but you can cut down foam core to be really perfectly edged. You just get a bigger piece than you need. If you cut it down to size already in the store, the problem is that if you then put it in your cart and your corners get dinged, then you're screwed. So I always like to get a bigger piece and cut it down later, because in case there's any damage that happens, I know that I'm going to have crisp corners. So next up, we have the window mat. And this is a window mat that is a really harmonious color for this particular print. And the other thing that I want you to notice is that it's not a straight cut, right? So one of the challenges with cutting an elegant window mat is that you want what's called a beveled cut. You want it to sort of slope down to the artwork. If you do a straight cut, it's not going to be as beautiful. And they sell mat cutters and like tools that you can get that will help you do that. If you're just starting out and you are feeling a little intimidated by buying all this equipment, this is one of those things where it's not a bad idea often you can bring your own mat board to an art supply store that has a frame shop and pay for the cuts. So you can get a better deal if you bring your own artboard. It depends on the store, all that stuff. But if I'm doing a large print like this, the mat board might cost, $15, and if I make a mistake cutting it, then that's going to come out of the cost of the framing. And so you just want to be careful with really good mat boards. Sometimes it's worth having somebody actually cut it down for you, and they will do a perfect job. But if you're feeling adventurous and you want to cut your own, just remember that you do want to have that bevel sloping into all of your artwork. Now, so traditionally, the front mat and the back mat are both mat board. For me, I'm able to save money by using this Archival foam core, but it does make the next step a little bit trickier. So traditionally what you would do is you would connect these two pieces, sort of like a book opening up, right? And what you'd want to use, the tape for all of this, is you want to use linen hanging tape. This is the type that has a paper backing. They also sell it, so in order to activate the tape, you basically have to sort of peel back the paper, and then you have a sort of pre-sticky thing. They do sell ones that you have to activate with water, and I strongly discourage you from using that tape. This is so much better. Just get the stuff with the paper back. If it has, the box looks the same, but if it has a little like water droplet right here, that's your tears. That's you crying as you try to put together your frame. Get the one with the paper back. For me, I work on this really delicate Japanese paper, and I found that the moisture content of the water-activated tape can actually damage my paper and cause it to wrinkle. So if you're working with delicate papers, that's something to be aware of. So traditionally what you would have is that these two sheets would be hinged together. Now I've made that impossible for myself because I'm working on two different materials that have two different heights. And then traditionally what you would do is once they're hinged together firmly, you would then tape your artwork down to this area. And then, of course, this flap would come on top of it. Now, I'm doing kind of a variation on this, and some printmakers might not necessarily approve of this, but I've had issues where I might get everything lined up and then the outer one shifts a little bit. The frame isn't perfect. There's a little bit more wiggle room inside the frame than I totally want, and then all of a sudden this mat moves, but the bottom image doesn't, and then it's no longer lined up perfectly. So this is my variation on that, and please feel free to disagree with me if you will, that's fine. But what I've done here is I've actually taped it down to this top corner using a sort of T formation. So when you're taping down your artwork on paper, paper tends to stretch and shrink depending on the moisture of the space that you are in. So if you move from California to the East Coast, there's going to be a lot more humidity, and it's going to really change. Your paper is going to stretch, and you don't want it to stretch but be trapped, otherwise it can cause your paper to wrinkle inside the frame. But you'll see I've kind of made a little T formation where I've got one piece of tape going this way, and the other piece of tape holding it down, going crossways. And I've done that twice. Now, this print could probably use one more, maybe right here. It seems like it is unnecessary, but depending on the width of the print that you're using, you may choose to use more of these little cross beams, and that's totally fine. Now, if you are floating your print instead of this style, there's a slightly different tape configuration. So let me show you that real quick too, so you guys can see that. So what you would do is if you're floating a print, got my little tape. It's the same idea of using two pieces of tape, but you want to use one piece of tape to hold the other piece of tape in place. So here we go. If I can get this piece of, there we go. So what I would do for work that I was floating is I would kind of tape them again, making that little T, right? So it's two pieces of tape taped to each other, but then this top part would fold down. I'd probably do a better job, but basically you would tape this to the background area, and then you would place your print right there on top. Press it down, and your print would stay floating. You do that 2 times along the top edge. Voila, floated print. You don't even need to mess with a mat. Do not mess with a mat. All right, so now that that is kind of in place, right, and I just have to be really careful with it, because this is probably why they don't like you to do it this way, because it sort of flutters, and the flutter can damage your work, all that stuff. But now it's all together, looking good. The next step is you want to have a piece of glass cut down dimensions for your frame. Now, most galleries and museums do not want to mess with actual glass. Do not waste your time with buying regular glass. The art community has moved beyond glass. The art community has moved to plexiglass. So plexiglass is lighter. Plexiglass is easier to ship. It won't break when you're trying to ship the work. I just think galleries had one too many pieces kind of fall off the wall, get bumped, get shattered, and they make the work really heavy and fragile. So get a piece of plexiglass and get it cut down to the size of your piece. Depending on where you live, for those of you in the Bay Area, I use something called tap plastics. And what's great about that is that they don't make me buy the excess, right? I order and I get to pay for the cut that they give me. Depending on where you are, I've ordered plexiglass from places where you have to buy the full 4-foot by 8-foot sheet, and then they'll cut from it what you need. But then you have all these like scrap pieces that you've got to sort of use. You can cut plexi down to yourself. It's a little hairy. It helps to have a table with a sharp edge. You clamp down your ruler, you score, and then you go, and you can, sometimes it doesn't work out well, sometimes it does. But you can technically cut down your own plexiglass if you're feeling bold and you've got scrap pieces that could be useful to you. As long as you're breaking off a big enough piece. If you're trying to break off a little sliver, heaven help you. All right, so I've got myself a piece of plexiglass. It's cut down, all that good stuff. Now let's talk about the frame. Okay. So here is the frame that I've been working with. This is a fairly deep frame. It's because with my work sometimes I like to float it, and this is a frame that has deep enough for a spacer, or will still have present if you put the package pushed forward. So a traditional frame like this has basically just like, this is the back side, and it has this little lip here, and this will catch your glass, it'll catch your packaging, all your artwork will kind of sit up against this front surface, and then we will just cover up the back. Now, I order these frames cut to size from a place online called Westfall Framing. They're based in Tallahassee. I've been using them for years. They've been fine. They've been pretty reasonable and pretty affordable. But if you have a different frame supplier that you like, that you've had good experience with, please leave that in a comment, you know. So these guys, this is what this frame is. This is from Westfall. This is their HW14. And the HW14 in their sort of museum style, this is the ash clear coat. And what they'll do is you buy it by the length. So you'll, instead of like trying to take this to the wood shop and try to miter it and all that stuff, you're going to be getting lengths of wood that you would then hammer together. And they do a thing where they have this little corner part already chiseled out and these little plastic pieces that you can hammer in. So what you would do is you would use a combination of a little bit of wood glue and then hammer this in, and that kind of holds it together while the glue dries. It really is the glue that holds the frame together. This is just something to kind of hold it clamped while the glue cures. Okay, so depending on the size of your artwork, HW14 is great for this sort of mid-sized work. For larger work, I've used the HW40, but that's a pretty chunky looking frame. I've also used the HW13 for really tiny work, so it really depends on what the size of the work that you're using and all of that good stuff. If you are making a shadow box tile floated print, the spacer frame is called HW16, just as is the Westfall. Other thing I wanted to mention here is that I have pre-drilled holes for my wire to go. If you've ever worked with hardwood frames before or just worked with hardwood, it's really important to drill the hole in advance, because otherwise you're going to risk the wood cracking. So if you haven't bought a drill yet, it's a time for you to get a drill. The small bit usually works pretty well, just clearing out that hole. You'll notice that this is actually about 1/4 of the way up the frame. So this is a 1/4 way up, so just measure the length and then drill right there. Another thing to mention here is the dimensions of frame that you order. When you're referring to a frame, it's the inside dimensions, right, that you are putting in and specifying. So I cut down my mat to 26.5 by 20.5. And this frame is that same size. So when I order a frame, I'm ordering it to the same size of the mat board. I'm not trying to calculate it in from the outside dimensions. Okay, it's the inside dimensions. So your mat board, your frame, you just order it the same size as your mat board. And so that's can you imagine how confusing it would be if it wasn't that way? But shout out to my old professor, John Swindler, who taught me how to frame. He was like, this is your BFA show, Hannah, you can do this. So once you've got your frame put together, once you've drilled your little holes and you're ready to kind of put your package in, we'll go to the next step. Okay, so now you've got your frame, and you can see how the plexiglass that's cut to the size just fits right into the frame. That looks great. Now, one of the problems with plexiglass, there's two problems. It can get scratched. There are some things you can do if your plexiglass gets scratched. There's some polishing compounds that you can get. I've used something like this. And I've actually used something like this. If you're diligent enough, you can get out a pretty substantial scratch. You just have to take your time, keep polishing, keep buffing. You can get out a scratch. The other thing that happens with plexiglass is that it is static electricity. And ideally you'd be framing in a home that doesn't have pets, but let's be real, everyone has a cat or a little dog. So just be careful that like any little hairs or dust in your house will stick to the plexiglass. And you cannot clean plexiglass with Windex. You cannot use glass cleaner on plexiglass. You actually do need to get a plexi cleaner. This is the one that I've been using. And you can get one of those, there we go, you know, microfiber cloths to clean the glass with. I'm just using a bandana. Sometimes the microfiber cloths, you just have to make sure you get them washed every once in a while, because sometimes they get like so much dust in them that then they cause their own scratches. But always make sure that you clean the glass really thoroughly, and then hold it up to the light and check for cat fur. Like, do an idiot check. There's nothing worse than like putting your frame together and then realizing that there's a hair in it. You know, so, sorry, this is probably not a good angle for you, but it helps for me to prop it up and kind of look at it like that. So this frame is actually not too dirty, so it's holding in there pretty well. Initially, when you get plexiglass that's fresh cut and you peel off that backing material, that's when like the maximum static electricity is happening. So I've had instances where I'll put artwork in a plexiglass frame that's floated, and generally you only tape it along the top side, but I've had the bottom paper kind of go and stick itself to the glass, and so eventually that static action will actually dissipate. It takes a while, so don't panic. So now that I've cleaned my glass thoroughly, I'm ready to pop my little package into place. So I've got my little package load it in. Kind of push it to the front. And then the most important thing, you check for hairs. Because somehow, no matter how good a job you've done, there are gonna be freaking hairs. This is a realistic vision of cleaning your plexiglass. So, you know, you do your first round, and that's cute. And then you gotta make sure there's no dirt between your glass and your artwork. And sometimes it's helpful to have a friend double check this with you. Be like, hey, before I staple this all together, do you see any dirt on the inside? Do you have a different angle than me? What have you? All that stuff. Sometimes it's actually stuck to the paper, right? You clean the glass, but now something is new sticking to the glass because it was on the paper. So go ahead and take your time here. This actually is really important. Okay, that looks good. All right. All right, so then I can go ahead and put my frame over this, and I'm ready to go to the next step. If you've already drilled the holes in your frame, make sure that they are on the upper register. So, you know, I've stapled prints in and I've stapled them in rotated. You know, I feel like I've made every single mistake that you can make framing. So once I know that there's no dirt on the inside of the frame, if I get a little bit on the outside, I can kind of deal with that. It's dirt that's on the inside that I'm not going to be able to access once the frame is all kind of stapled together. So just keep checking. Deep breath. All right, we got this. So next up, I'm going to go ahead and staple this in place. So flip it over, and this is a tool that I like to use for this. This is my point driver. It is a Fletcher brand. And the way this works is you have your framing points kind of loaded in like it's a staple gun. So when you buy replacement points for your point driver, just make sure that they're not the ones for window glazing. They're a slightly different point than the ones for framing. So then I can kind of pull this open and then lock it in. And so this is kind of your fancy staple gun. All right, everything is aligned properly. So some people have strong opinions on their various different point drivers. This one has held up for me for the last 10 years. I use it like all the time. So I feel like this is a pretty good point driver, but I mean, I won't say it's the best or anything. It's a good one, and it's held up. Anyhow, if you're thinking about getting a point driver, so then what you want to do is you want to put the point driver up against the edge like this, and it'll drop in a point. And I tend to do one in the middle, one in the corner, and then I'll do another one over here, kind of in between those 2 points for good measure. So, and I'll put my hand on the outside of it while I'm doing it. I know this feels dangerous, but it doesn't actually pierce that deep into the wood. But I can, if I don't support the frame while I do the points, I can jostle and crack the corner of my frame. So it's really good to kind of hold it so it doesn't, like, even if you don't want to put your hand right there, to like hold it secure so that it absorbs a little bit of the energy of delivering the point. Carry on. Okay, so it looks great. This is the part where you flip it over and then you find yourself a hair. Check it. Make sure that you don't have dirt in your mat. Okay, this looks pretty good. All right, so next up, what you want to do is you want to attach D-rings to these edges here, and we'll talk about attaching the wire. Next up, I want to talk about D-rings. So D-ring, this is the thing that you're going to order to attach your hardware. This is your hardware to attach the wire to your frame. So this is a little guy. This one will work great for the size frame that I'm working on today. But they do come in different weights depending on the size of frame you're doing. This is a much heavier duty weight. It can take a heavier print. Same concept, except for this one I would have to drill 2 holes instead of 1. For something like this where I have to drill these specific holes, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and lay it down on the frame and go ahead and go with a pencil and draw out where those drill holes need to be. The main thing you want to be conscientious about is when you're attaching the wire, and this is a very heavy duty wire. This could handle a 50-pound frame. It's not often that the wire breaks. It's more likely that the wire slips. So when you're attaching the wire to the D-ring, what you want to do is you want to loop it like this. Okay. And then you want to do it again. Loop it twice. So actually what I'll do is I'll kind of crisscross so that the wires loop across each other like this. And that extra loop here, that double loop, actually makes it so it won't slip out. So then I can go in and twist these 2 wires together. So you can kind of go up like that and twist it together. Okay? And I can do this for both sides, and then I'll have a wire that I can attach to the frame. Sometimes I'll attach the D-rings to the frame first and then attach the wire, but just make sure you do that double loop. That's the thing that really matters. If you're having trouble screwing it in, it may be that you haven't drilled it enough. Be careful, you really don't want to strip your screws when you're putting in your wire, or you don't want to, it'll make it really hard for you to make changes or update your work. There is a step here that I am skipping. So sometimes with a really fancy frame shop, they will actually tape down a piece of butcher paper right here on the back. That's optional. I feel like that can help in the long term keep out dust and kind of keep your artwork looking, fresh, but it's another step to add and it doesn't really show from the front, so all that good stuff. Now I've got a little bit of a wire and that's pretty firm. So I have one framed artwork. And I have a philosophy on this. I feel like generally speaking, you want to keep your frame as simple as possible. You really want people to give their energy to the artwork, and the energy that they spend looking and noticing the frame is a second that they have spent not looking at your artwork. So it's kind of discouraging sometimes because you spend all this energy and money to make a frame that then nobody notices it. But that's kind of a sign that it was successful, because if they didn't notice the frame, it's because they're too busy looking at the artwork, that the frame was completely successful in its task of displaying the artwork. So there we go. Last little bit here. When you're hanging work in your home or in a gallery, you want the middle of the artwork to be at eye level. Okay, so traditionally eye level is 60 to 62 inches. Depending on the curator if they're tall or not. I generally hang my work at 60 inches. I feel like that's just easy for me. My eyes happen to be at 60 inches because I'm short. So I'll just put this at 60 inches. And so what you want to do is you want to figure out how much space is here, right? So once the wire is on tension, what is the distance between the middle point and the tense wire? And that plus 60 is where you should put your nail to hang this work. And so that's just kind of like figure out what this distance is. Another strategy here is you can hold the work up on the wall and then make a little mark. I like to do this. I'll make a little pencil mark on the wall at the top of the print, and then what I'll do is I'll measure down to that point where I should put the nail. So I can measure up and like see that it looks good, because I trust my eye sometimes more than I trust a ruler. And so that's kind of how I do that, and good luck. That's how you frame a piece. And if you frame your own work this way, eventually you will save a lot of money. This starts to be really helpful when you're looking at custom sizes, if you're starting to look at really big work. My advice for my students is that if you make a piece that you're proud of, frame it up now. Don't wait to have a show before you frame your work. You'd be surprised how more likely you are to show if your work is just ready to go. You know, like, go ahead and put that intention out there and get your work in frames, and so if an opportunity comes your way, you can say, yes, not only will I show my work work is ready to be delivered right now, and I can go ahead and take up that sort of surprise opportunity, because you never know. And it's also a really good way to have work that you finished recently up hanging in your house, so you can continue to look at it and think about it, and think about how you want to grow from that last piece. So anyhow, hang in there, you guys, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.